There is a man alive today whose voice has narrated your dreams, explained the universe, and played God so convincingly that when you close your eyes, it sounds exactly like him. But the man behind that voice is not the legend Hollywood made him out to be. For 50 years, he was told he wouldn't make it, cleaning floors, driving taxis, watching younger actors with half his talent walk into rooms he couldn't enter. By the time the world decided he mattered, fate had already delivered its price. A car wreck that destroyed his left hand, decades of unrelenting pain, and a heartbreak no one could imagine. This is Morgan Freeman, not the voice you know, but the man who refused to disappear. The Invisible Boy. Morgan Freeman was born on June 1, 1937, in Memphis, Tennessee. But Memphis isn't where his story begins. His story begins in the dust. In the cotton fields and back roads of Charleston, Mississippi, on a town so small and so poor that the poverty didn't even feel like poverty, because everyone was drowning in it equally. The Deep South in the late 1930s wasn't just segregated. It was a system designed with surgical precision to make black children understand, before they could even read, that their lives had been assigned a value, and that value was almost nothing. Jim Crow wasn't a law you encountered occasionally. It was the air. It was the water fountain you couldn't drink from. It was the bus you couldn't ride, the school you couldn't attend, the sidewalk you stepped off when a white person approached. Morgan's father was a barber. His mother was a teacher who cleaned houses on the side. 2 incomes, and it still wasn't enough. So they did what thousands of Depression-era families did with a pain that never fully heals. They sent their child away. Morgan was raised by his paternal grandmother in a house with no electricity and no running water, on wearing clothes stitched from flour sacks, picking cotton under a sun that didn't care how old you were as long as your hands could work. Years later, he would say, with the kind of honesty that only comes from distance, "We were so poor, we didn't even know we were poor. Everyone around us lived the same way." He learned to read in a one-room schoolhouse where black children used textbooks the white schools had thrown away. But he also learned something else in that schoolhouse, and something that would take 50 years to pay off. At age 9, he was cast in a school play, a small production, parents and teachers in the audience, a makeshift stage that was probably just a cleared corner of the room. But the moment he stepped into that role, something inside him shifted permanently. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. He wasn't the poor kid, the sent-away kid, the black kid the world had already decided didn't matter. He was seen. He was heard. And the feeling was so powerful, so completely unlike anything he had ever experienced, that he would spend the next 5 decades chasing it through rejection after rejection after rejection. "I fell in love with acting that day," he said decades later. "Not because of the attention, but because, for the first time, I felt like I mattered." But dreams and empty stomachs have never coexisted peacefully. His family moved constantly, chasing work from Mississippi to Chicago to Indiana and back. Morgan was always the new kid, always the outsider. At Broad Street High School in Greenwood, Mississippi, he threw himself into drama club while other boys played football or picked up after-school jobs. A teacher there, a drama instructor whose name Morgan would carry with gratitude for the rest of his life, told him something no one had ever said before. "You have a gift. Don't waste it." It was the first time anyone had suggested he was built for something beyond survival. But gifts don't pay rent. When he graduated in 1955, Hollywood might as well have been on another planet. Black actors in the 50s were offered servants, slaves, and stereotypes. That was the menu. So Morgan joined the Air Force, not because he wanted to serve, but because he needed to eat. He trained as a radar technician, served his time, and hated every minute of it. "I thought the Air Force would give me discipline," he later admitted. "Instead, it taught me what I didn't want to be." In 1959, at 22, he left the military and moved to Los Angeles with a duffel bag, a few dollars, and a plan that everyone in his life told him was insane. 30 years of no Los Angeles broke him quickly. Auditions led nowhere. Casting directors looked at him and saw a background face, a body to fill a doorway, a janitor, a bellhop, a criminal. Roles that didn't require a name. He lasted less than 2 years before the rejection pushed him east. In 1960, he moved to New York, chasing theater, the one corner of the industry where black actors had even a narrow crack of opportunity. New York was brutal in a different dialect. Rent swallowed everything. Hundreds of actors lined up for a single role, and the roles available to him were still humiliating. Servants, slaves, nameless extras. He would later say something about those years that cuts deeper every time I read it. "I spent years being invisible on stage, just like I was invisible back in Mississippi. Only now I was invisible by choice, and that made it worse." To survive, he took every job the city offered. He danced in the chorus at the 1964 World's Fair. He drove a taxi through Manhattan, rehearsing monologues in traffic while picking up fares. He filed papers as a transcript clerk. Every dollar went toward rent, food, and the fading belief that the next audition would be different. The next audition was never different. He turned 25, and then 28, then 30. Friends from acting class gave up and went home. Others found real jobs and let the dream die quietly. Morgan kept going, but the weight of it was crushing. He married Jeanette Adair Bradshaw in 1967, and suddenly acting wasn't just a dream, it was irresponsible. He had children to feed, bills stacking up, and a career that existed only in his imagination. In 1967, he landed a role in an all-black production of Hello, Dolly on Broadway, starring Pearl Bailey. It wasn't a lead, it wasn't even close to a lead, but it was Broadway, and it was legitimate, and it taught him something he would carry forever. Watching Pearl Bailey command that stage night after night, he learned that power doesn't come from volume. "She didn't need to shout to be heard," he recalled. "That's when I learned that sometimes the quietest voice is the loudest." The 70s arrived, and Morgan was pushing 35 with almost nothing to show for 15 years of work. And his marriage was cracking. His children needed a stability he couldn't provide. Hollywood still saw him as expendable. He auditioned for film roles and was told his face was too intense, his voice too deep, his presence too serious. The industry wanted black comedians, not black Shakespearean actors. Depression moved into his apartment like a roommate who wouldn't leave. There were nights he sat alone wondering if he'd made the worst decision of his life. If he should have stayed in the Air Force, taken a government job, lived the kind of life where you don't spend every evening wondering if your dream is actually a delusion. Then PBS offered him a children's show, The Electric Company. He played Easy Reader, a hip character who made literacy fun for kids. It wasn't film, it wasn't prestigious, but it was steady work and national exposure. And for 5 years, he showed up every day and performed for an audience of kindergartners who had no idea their favorite TV character was a frustrated Shakespearean actor barely making rent. By the time the show ended, he was 40 years old. Beloved by 5-year-olds, invisible to Hollywood. 2 decades gone, and the dream felt further away than the day he left Mississippi. The door finally opens by his mid-40s, Morgan had accepted a truth that most people would find unbearable, and he would never be a movie star. Too old for leading roles, too unknown for studio films, too proud to keep playing stereotypes. But he would not quit. He pivoted to Shakespeare, performing Coriolanus and Titus Andronicus on the theater circuit. And critics started using words like gravity and commanding and unlike anyone working today. In 1980, he originated the role of Hoke Colburn in Driving Miss Daisy off-Broadway, a gentle chauffeur navigating racial tension in the Jim Crow South. The production was modest. The performance was not. Theater awards followed. Hollywood, slowly, reluctantly, began to pay attention. In 1987, at 50 years old, he was cast in Street Smart as Fast Black, a violent pimp, opposite Christopher Reeve. The film barely registered at the box office. Morgan's performance detonated. Dangerous, unpredictable, terrifying. When the Oscar nominations were announced in 1988, his name appeared for the first time. Best Supporting Actor. 50 years old. Had 3 decades of invisibility. Finally seen. He lost to Sean Connery. But the nomination rewired everything. Casting directors who had dismissed him for years started calling. Scripts appeared. And then came 1989, the year that made Morgan Freeman undeniable. Driving Miss Daisy was adapted into a film. His performance as Hoke was the soul of it, understated and devastating. And it earned him a second Oscar nomination, this time for Best Actor. That same year, he appeared in Glory alongside Denzel Washington, playing Sergeant Major John Rawlins with a dignity that made every scene he touched feel heavier and more important. 2 nominations in 2 years. At 52, he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was arriving. But the bitterness of timing never fully dissolved. I spent 30 years preparing for success that came when most actors retire, he said. Part of me was grateful. Another part was angry it took so long. Then came Shawshank. In 1994, The Shawshank Redemption opened to modest numbers and lukewarm reviews. A noble failure, critics called it. But Morgan's performance as Red, the institutionalized lifer narrating Andy Dufresne's impossible escape, carried a weight that wouldn't let the film die. As it found its second life on cable television and home video, Shawshank transformed into something sacred. Consistently ranked among the greatest films ever made, it became inseparable from Morgan's voice. That line, I guess it comes down to a simple choice really, get busy living or get busy dying, stopped being dialogue and became something closer to scripture. 7 followed in 1995, then Amistad in 1997. And finally, in 2004, $1 Million Baby. Morgan played Eddie Scrap Iron Dupree, a former boxer narrating the tragic story of Maggie Fitzgerald. And once again, his voice turned heartbreak into something almost beautiful. When the 2005 Academy Awards announced Best Supporting Actor, Morgan Freeman's name was called. He was 67 years old, 4 nominations over 17 years. He walked to that stage carrying 50 years of cotton fields and taxi cabs, and empty audition rooms and children's television and off-Broadway stages, and every single night he'd spent wondering if the dream was a lie. His speech was brief. No grand declarations about perseverance, just gratitude, delivered in that voice, cracking just slightly at the edges. And the people who knew his story understood what that statue actually weighed. The bill arrives. August 3, 2008. A dark stretch of highway in Tallahatchie County, Mississippi. The same soil where Morgan Freeman once spent summers picking cotton as a boy, became the site of a night that would change his life forever. At 71, He was behind the wheel of his Nissan Maxima, cruising along a two-lane road with a friend beside him. What happened next was abrupt, terrifying, and still not entirely understood. Something, a swerve to miss an animal, a blown tire, sheer exhaustion in the Mississippi heat, sent the car off the pavement. It flipped and flipped again. Rescuers had to tear the mangled metal apart with the jaws of life to free him and his passenger. Freeman was conscious but gravely injured when they airlifted him to a hospital in Memphis, the city where he was born, and began a life that would be defined by persistence and reinvention. Hours of surgery followed. His shoulder, arm, and elbow were shattered. Nerves in his left hand were severed beyond repair. Doctors were frank. The hand would never fully work again. The physical toll was immense, but it was only the beginning. The nerve damage triggered fibromyalgia, a chronic pain condition that floods the body with relentless stabbing and burning sensations. Some days he could function. Other days he couldn't lift his arm to brush his teeth. And the once invincible actor, the man whose voice could fill a cathedral from a tiny booth, was forced to wear a compression glove permanently, a visible mark of fragility on someone the world considered immortal. Pain rewrote his craft. Directors learned to shoot around the glove. Scripts were adjusted. Simple joys, holding a grandchild's hand, strumming a guitar, even shaking someone else's, slipped away. And yet, he kept working, not for money, but to defy the body that demanded surrender. But nothing in Hollywood could have prepared him for what came next. August 16, 2015. A phone call in the middle of the night tore through the fragile quiet of his Mississippi life. His step-granddaughter, Edina Hines, was pronounced dead on a Washington Heights sidewalk in New York City. She was 33. She had been stabbed repeatedly, evidence would later show more than 24 brutal blows, by her boyfriend outside her apartment. They heard screaming. Neighbors saw it happen. By the time police arrived, she was gone. Freeman was states away, raw with pain and disbelief. Friends said he collapsed when the call came. When he arrived in New York, he was met with police tape and crimson on concrete, a scene no amount of success or superstardom could ever reconcile. In a rare public statement, he said simply that the world will never know her artistry and talent, that she had much life left to give. But no words could build a bridge over the shock, the grief, and the senselessness of it. Then came another blow, one that would test the most unshakable reputation in Hollywood. May 24, 2018. At the height of the hashtag #MeToo movement, CNN published an investigation in which 8 women accused Freeman of harassment or inappropriate behavior spanning decades. On film sets, at promotional events, and inside his own production company. They described unwanted touching, comments about their bodies and clothing, and moments that made them uncomfortable or uneasy. And according to the report, 16 people were interviewed, 8 who said they had been subjected to this behavior, and 8 who said they had witnessed it. Some allegations touched on moments during press junkets, where Freeman, a man known for roles that embodied dignity and moral gravity, reportedly made comments that crossed boundaries. One involved remarks where he looked a female reporter up and down during an interview and made comments that she later described as inappropriate. And at his own production company, former staffers described him lingering too close, making comments about appearance, or touching women in ways they felt unwelcome. Freeman responded with a statement acknowledging he may not always have come across the way I intended, apologizing to anyone who felt uncomfortable or disrespected, and asserting that disrespect was never his intent. But he also made it clear he did not believe he had created unsafe environments or assaulted anyone. and his legal team demanded a retraction from the network. The Screen Actors Guild ultimately did not revoke his Lifetime Achievement Award, and no criminal charges were filed. But in the court of public opinion, the myth of the voice of God was cracked, revealing something more complicated. A man whose humanity could be as flawed as anyone else's. Someone capable of making millions feel inspired, and others feel uneasy. Morgan Freeman's life has been a parade of contradictions. Triumph and pain, blessing and heartbreak, adoration and controversy. A voice that taught the world about hope came from a body that knew deep hurt. And that is the complexity few want to confront. A legend still grappling with the consequences of his past, to still human beneath the myth. At 87, Morgan Freeman lives on a Mississippi ranch that holds more than just land. It holds a lifetime of struggle, triumph, and survival. One hand crippled, decades of pain etched into his body. And yet, his voice still commands the world. This isn't the story of an icon. It's the story of a man who refused to disappear. The Oscars didn't define him. Fame didn't protect him. And peace. Well, peace is something he's still learning to claim. Today, as we step behind the curtain of legend and meet the human being Morgan Freeman has spent a lifetime trying to become.